Welcome to UO Today. I'm Paul Peppis, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Today we're in the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art with James Harper, Associate Professor in the University of Oregon's Department of the History of Art and Architecture. Harper is a specialist in 16th and 17th century Italian art and the Director of the University of Oregon's Interdisciplinary Museum Studies program. He curated this exhibition, the Barberini Tapestries, Woven Monuments of Baroque Rome, which is on view through January 21st, 2018. Thanks, Jamie, for coming on the show.
Oh, sure. Thanks for having me.
So my first question is a big one. What's special about this exhibition?
What's special about this exhibition? Well, everything, of course. But let me say that these tapestries that are surrounding us here are things that once hung in some of the most splendid locations in Rome. I'm thinking about the Palazzo Barberini, the family palace of the cardinal who commissioned them, but also they were loaned from time to time to St. Peter's Basilica and numerous other locations around Rome. And to have something here in Eugene, Oregon, at the University of Oregon, on our campus, that was at St. Peter's Basilica, I think that's special. But also, I would say the scale of these things, the way that we've tried to install them so that you come in as a viewer and are just surrounded by these things. I think that's very special. I hope you feel that.
Oh yeah, it's an amazing, amazing experience to be in the space with them and to smell them too. I mean, the sensual experiences in every regard.
Yeah. They smell like old books.
It's a smell I like. Yeah. So why were tapestries prized during the Baroque period?
Well, I think this is a good question, and people tend today to prize them less because we think about artistic genius in a different way. But in the Baroque period, a tapestry series like this would be, first of all, designed by the great towering genius artist, and in that case this was Giovanni Francesco Romanelli. So you had the participation of the celebrity artist, but then on top of that, we're just going to gild the lily here, and on top of that you've got the man hours that go into to weaving a tapestry series. Each of the 12 panels in this series took nearly a year to produce, with about 6 weavers working side by side, but also all of the work behind them, the dyers and the spinners and all of that. And so I think that the Baroque connoisseur would look at these things and understand not just the beauty of them, but also the extraordinary investment of man hours. And so I think that's another reason they're prized. And then I think there's something else that these have that paintings don't have, which is that warm materiality to them. So the inventories, when somebody inventories the goods in their palace, they'll often inventory from the most valuable things down to the least valuable things, and tapestries always come first.
Fascinating. So who were the Barberinis, and how did they come to found their own tapestry manufactory?
So the Barberini are the family of Pope Urban VIII. They're originally a Tuscan family, but when Maffeo Barberini was elected Pope, most of the family moved to Rome because, after all, the Pope needs his relatives to help. And also, when your uncle is elected Pope, my advice to you, if your uncle is ever elected Pope, get to Rome right away because there are a lot of great opportunities for the family. Rome is interesting because it has a sort of elective monarchy. Over the 17th century, there are about a dozen popes, so you've got a turnover on average about every 8 years. Some popes last only 2.5 years. Other popes, like Urban VIII, last 21 years. But the point is that with this elective monarchy, you have family after family kind of catapulted to the very height of power and prestige and all the splendor that goes with it. And this is what happened to the Barberini. When Urban VIII was elected in 1623, the families started to build things, build churches, palaces, chapels, and decorate those palaces with collections of art, ancient art and modern art. And the cardinal nephew, Cardinal Francesco Barberini, who was the Pope's sidekick, sort of his prime minister, secretary of state gatekeeper, hatchet man, chief of staff. The cardinal nephew did all those things. And this cardinal nephew, Cardinal Francesco Barberini, was a great patron of art. He understood art a lot, art and also music and philosophy, and he was a writer himself. But he also understood that there was a competition between his own family and all of those other papal families who were left over from prior pontificates. And let me also say, in the future, all the future papal families who are coming down the road. And so when he decided to found a tapestry workshop in the late 1620s, it was, I think, a really aggressive act of competition. Nobody else in Rome had a tapestry manufactory. And most tapestry manufacture took place in the Netherlands and northeastern France. And when the cardinal did this, the only other fine tapestry manufactory south of the Alps was the Medici tapestry manufactory in Florence. And I mean, that's the Medici, right? Who are moreover, rulers. They rule like kings as the Grand Dukes of Tuscany. So Cardinal Barberini founds this tapestry workshop and basically beats everybody else who couldn't even compete in that game. And it was a kind of quasi-royal act of patronage.
So what sets the Life of Christ series apart from the other tapestries that come out of their workshop?
Right. There are 7 tapestry series that come out of the Barberini Tapestry Workshop. I would say the Life of Christ, sounds like a dull answer, but it's the most generic, right? Some of the tapestries that come out of the tapestry works are very, very personal. There's a series that follows this one immediately after the Life of Christ. They weave a life of Apollo, stories of Apollo, in which Apollo is actually a stand-in for Cardinal Francesco Barberini, the patron. There's another one, the last series, and the grandest series that they wove was the life of Pope Urban VIII, and it took, I call it perfect history. It took the history of his pontificate and drew forth the best episodes and suppressed the worst episodes, and then took the best episodes and through inclusions and omissions made them even better. So these are very, very deeply personal ones. This one, on the other hand, tells a kind of universally applicable story, which is the life of Christ. Yes, there are Barberini-specific motifs in the borders. You've got the coats of arms. You've got symbols of the family in the borders. And you also do have some references to things in the Barberini family collections. The crucifixion right over there, for instance, is a copy of the altarpiece of the family chapel in the Palazzo Barberini. But to step back, so there are things that are personal about this series, but I would say it stands apart from the others in that it is let me say again, generic, universally applicable, and I think that was what this assignment called for, because this was a series that did a lot of work around the city. The cardinal would loan this out, would loan it to a church for its feast day. I mentioned earlier that it would be loaned to St. Peter's Basilica for the feasts of St. Peter, the feast of St. Peter and Paul, or for the coronation of new popes. And it was a kind of workhorse of the family's tapestry loan program. And I think in that sense, the relatively conservative imagery here suited the purpose very well.
So you mentioned the borders. Tell us about the borders, some of the significance of the motifs that are in the borders.
Okay, well the borders have the fiction is that they imitate the forms of very, very fancy wooden frames, gilt wooden frames with little stucco decorations all intertwined. And you've got in each corner the Barberini coat of arms, which is 3 bees in gold on a field of blue. That's surrounded by a tight wreath of laurel, and the laurel was another symbol of the family. The cardinal liked to think of himself as a new Apollo. He put the sun as a motif all around the palace, as did his uncle the Pope. So the laurel, connecting them to this myth of Apollo, also appears again in the twisting branches of laurel that wrap all around the circumference of the frame. And then there are cartouches with the cardinal virtues, faith, hope, and charity, that are at left, right, and bottom. And then in the very top, you've got one of two different Barberini imprese. And an impresa is a sort of it's kind of like a logo. It's a visual motif, often accompanied by a very brief inscription. And here we have two different types. One is the three Bs running a plow, which is a really weird one to us today. But in 17th century Rome, the Cardinal Barberini's contemporaries would have recognized this as one of his favorite symbols. And that comes from an ancient Roman gem. I think it was an onyx or an agate in his collection, on which was carved by, I think, a first century craftsman, this little image of three bees running a plow. And the Cardinal Barberini loved this thing because it was three bees, and so he bought it and he displayed it to his special guests, and he used to tell them that these three bees are like me and my two brothers. He had another brother who was also a cardinal and a brother who was a prince and a general of the church. He said, it's just like us. We three are all kind of harnessed together, working for the good of Rome. So, yeah, that in that sense, every time that motif appears, it sounds that kind of forcefully positive message of the family doing good things for the city and for the world. And then the other thing that you see in its place on some of the tapestries is the rising sun. And this is another favorite motif, often accompanied, although it's not in the tapestries, it appears without the inscription, but often accompanied with the inscription in Latin, aliosque et idem, which means different and yet the same. And just like the sun, which rises every day, different and yet it's still the same sun, so the Barberini dynasty will keep producing more generations of new cardinals and new princes who are different but are the same. So it expresses this idea of dynastic continuity.
So for the majority of the tapestries are scenes that are canonical scenes from the life of Christ. So Annunciation, the Nativity. Behind us is the agony in the garden, the crucifixion, the consignment of the keys. But the largest tapestry is of a map. Why?
Well, there are actually two map tapestries in this. The first one is the rest on the flight into Egypt, where you have a standard narrative scene in the foreground, the Holy Family sitting on this high ridge, resting. They're halfway from Israel into Egypt, and they're looking down across the Sinai Peninsula, and there's Egypt off in the distance, and there the landscape morphs into a map, and we have what I like to call the impossible view. It's as if you're standing on a ridge looking out over it, but you would never perceive all of that at once, from the cataracts of the Nile to the Mediterranean Sea. And what that map does is it shows you the places where the Holy Family are believed to have gone during their time as refugees in Egypt, and so you can, in a way, follow them. There's not a dotted line showing the route, and in fact, the route is nobody entirely agrees on which route they took or anything like that. But there are a lot of the key sites called out with little labels on it. Then the final tapestry in this series is, as you say, the largest, 19 feet wide, and it depicts a map of the Holy Land as if seen from kind of helicopter far above Cyprus. You're over the Mediterranean Sea, looking to the east. And on that map, I think there are about 175 sites labeled. I know because I went in there and had to explain each one of them to myself, if not to everybody else. And why would somebody have a map like that? Well, I think that there is a tradition of what I call armchair pilgrimage or virtual pilgrimage. And there's a whole section of the exhibition in the next gallery over that in which I've assembled a group of maps of the Holy Land, the kind of thing that people would use. They'd pull them out. Sometimes they'd be reading their Bible and finding things on the map, as a kind of aid to imagining the life of Christ, or even, let's speak more broadly, Scripture as a whole, Old Testament, New Testament, and sometimes, so you've got these things that enable you to imagine something of the realness of Scripture. If you can place it on a map, then it must, it becomes more vivid and more real. There's also, I think, with maps always this, you hold a map in your hand and you, in a way, you sort of possess something. You possess a connection to it and even a little bit of a command of it, even if the command is just knowledge and not actual political command. And I imagine the Cardinal Barberini in a gallery or a grand room in his palace hung with all these tapestries and strolling over and standing in front of the map of the Holy Land and pointing out the different places where all of these things happened. And so in a way it's a kind of guide to the series, although of course, as I said, there are 175 different places called out on it. So it's a guide to a whole kind of layered, imagined Holy Land. Some of the places on it were even to the Old Testament people prehistory. And so there are legends on the map. There's things that are scriptural. There are also things that are Byzantine monasteries and Crusader forts. And so it is. It's kind of like taking the mind and spreading it out on the map, if that's not too gross an analogy. We are filming, after all, on Halloween. And the city of Jerusalem appears in the middle of the map in its ancient first century form, the Jerusalem that Christ would have known. And let me say, in the form that the map makers believed to be the form that Christ would have known. And then down in the cartouche at the bottom, there is a map of modern Jerusalem, the Jerusalem that a pilgrim in the 16th or 17th century might have encountered. So I think right there, that juxtaposition of past and present, it's all kind of there in the map, and you shimmer between eras in it.
So how did these tapestries end up at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York City? Well,
the tapestries were in the possession of the Barberini family. The Cardinal Barberini commissioned them, and they were woven in the 1640s and 50s. For about another 75 years or so, they were used fairly frequently, but then grand manner Baroque tapestry fell from style in the mid-18th century, and I think that these spent a certain amount of time in the storerooms after that. Meanwhile, in America, you have in the 19th century this growth of a new kind of plutocratic class in what writers have called the Gilded Age, and these new people with new fortunes wanted to cast themselves as kind of the new Medici and the new Barberini, and they're people like the Vanderbilts and the Hearsts built these great European-style palaces and filled them with the decorative arts and paintings that they bought in Europe and displayed in America. So against that whole context, there's this guy Charles Mather Folk, who is an American who had, a Pennsylvania guy who'd grown very wealthy in the wool trade. So he's interested in textiles. And he retired early and decided to remake himself as a scholar of tapestry. So he goes to Europe. There's no school where you can go to become a scholar of tapestry, but he goes around and he meets people and he has these conversations and he sees collections and he keeps his notes, and he starts buying tapestry. And he goes to the Prince of the Barberini and he says, "I would like to buy a series from you." And the prince says, "It's not for sale. I'm the Prince of the Barberini." And Charles Mather Folk, though, was persistent. And finally the prince said, "Okay, here's the deal. I will sell you that series that you want, but you have to take 140 tapestries." And so this guy, in a stroke, he wrote a check and took 140 tapestries. And in a stroke, he became not just a collector, but also a dealer, because he now had more tapestry than even he knew what to do with. So he brings the Barberini tapestries back to America. And he has a grand townhouse on Embassy Row in Washington, D.C., where he entertains people, and he's got a tapestry room, a sort of ballroom that is specifically built for hanging giant tapestry. And he shows his neighbors and friends and people in his social circles how to live with tapestry. And by the way, you can buy some of these if you like. Well, there was a lady in New York, Elizabeth Underhill Coles, who who bought a set from Charles Mather Folk, not for herself, even though she did have a collection, but she wanted to give it to the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, the Episcopal Cathedral that was just in the planning stages at this moment. And the moment we're talking about is 1889, 1890. And so in 1891, the Bishop of New York breaks ground on the new cathedral, and one of the first gifts that he has to furnish the still unfinished cathedral, one of the first gifts he has is this series. And when the cathedral was consecrated in 1911, they hung them, and I've got to say, even though they are Baroque and it is Gothic, Gothic revival, the sort of richness and splendor of it make a great complement to the building.
So tell us what happens to them while they're there at this cathedral. I mean, we have 10 of them here.
Right.
Why only 10?
Why only 10? Oh, Paul. Oh, Paul. So the tapestries, the cathedral is not a museum. It is a house of worship, and they display these as enhancements to worship. And they've got an interesting collection, too. I mean, they've got a Keith Haring Last Judgment altarpiece, so everything from Baroque tapestries to Keith Haring and even things beyond. But the tapestries were hanging on a partition wall in December 2001, a partition wall behind which was the gift shop. And there was an electrical fire that started in the middle of the night in the gift shop, and the fire spread rapidly, and the wooden partition wall burned, and a lot of other things burned as well. And by the time the fire department got the fire put out, 2 of the Barberini tapestries had been irreparably damaged. There were others that took some smoke, and but that's something that you can clean off. But the Last Supper and the Resurrection were both burned so severely that they lost about 40% of the material of them, and so. I mean, it just goes to show you that even today, the survival of things is never guaranteed. We did debate, my collaborator on this exhibition, Marlene Eidelheit, who's the chief conservator and director of the Textile Conservation Lab at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. And the cathedral has a huge collection of textiles, and they have set up a sort of semi-independent operation, the Textile Conservation Lab, which is one of the best in the country, started to take care of these things, but they also take in work from various museums and private collections. The Marlene Eidelheit, the director, and I debated a bit about how to represent the tapestries that had burned. We didn't want to show one of these great big 15.5-foot things half destroyed, because that somehow we didn't want the tragedy, and I mean they're shocking looking things when you see them in their destroyed state. We didn't want the tragedy to be so present. We didn't want it to outshine the glory of these things that have survived, and that now, after a 25-year conservation campaign that was slightly interrupted by the fire, but a major conservation campaign, they're looking better, I feel, than any time they have since the 17th century. So we didn't want to outshine these with the gloomy disaster, but we also felt we needed to represent it. And so in the case in the middle of the gallery here, you'll see a fragment that's about this big, and that shows the head of St. John the Evangelist from the Last Supper. And it's a very beautiful, kind of haunting object. Here's this beautiful face and the flowing hair just kind of emerging out of the singed material and the burned edge. So yeah, that's the kind of thing that probably never would have happened in a museum. But to circle back to your initial question, at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, it's not a museum, and these live in a different way. And
so tell us about the symposium that you've organized to accompany the exhibit.
Well, we have coming up in a couple of weeks, the dates are November 16th and 17th, a symposium on the Barberini and 17th century tapestry. We've invited some of the best people in the world for this, and I'm very pleased to say that nobody turned down our invitation. This is really nice. The tapestry, the world of tapestry scholars is a very is a very mutually supportive world, let me say. And so we've got Tom Campbell, who has just recently stepped down from being director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. He will chair one of our sessions. We've got a keynote address from Frederick Hammond, who is the author of a major book on the Barberini and music and spectacle in Rome. And he'll be setting these in the context of this sort of overall display, right? Because nowadays we tend to consider things medium by medium, but in the time of the Barberini, these were part of a multimedia show, in a sense. We have Konrad Brossens coming from Belgium. We have Charissa Bramer-David, who's the chief curator of tapestries at the Getty. We've got Lisa Pon, who's a professor at SMU, who is collaborating with an acoustic scientist and measuring the acoustic properties of tapestry and testing spaces with and without them. And she's actually presenting some new data, including her measurements of the acoustics of the cathedral when we hung all of these for our exhibition when it was there last spring and early summer. And I'm sure I'm forgetting one or two, but that gives you the sense of the scope of things, and
free and open to the public.
Free and open to the public, and it's going to be very exciting. And there's also on the Thursday evening, right prior to the keynote address, there is a concert where there will be a lutenist playing some of the music that was composed by Cardinal Francesco Barberini's in-house composer. So I think there will be something for everyone, and
great.
I would urge all your audience to come.
So we only have a minute or so left. Last question: why is it important for a university to host an exhibit like this? Why is that a good thing for a university to do?
Well, it seems so obvious to me, but let me try to articulate it. I think that what we do here at the University of Oregon is that we represent the world, right? The world, all the disciplines, all the periods, just everything out there. We represent that to our students, and also, I would say, to our community beyond our students. But primarily, the first wave is towards our students, and then it extends. And what we're showing in this gallery is something that is not only of a sort of great historical interest, but also something that is of experiential interest. I think that those of us who've had the opportunity to live in Europe among these kind of objects, it's less surprising, right? We know what it is to walk into a room and be entirely surrounded by art, whether it's a tapestry series or a fresco cycle or a ceiling. But I think that here we're delivering this experience to our students, and I think that's just one example of hundreds of things that we're doing here in this museum and here on this campus every day.
Well, that's a great place to end our interview. Thank you, Jamie, for talking with us today. I would urge everyone to come and see this amazing exhibit. Come to the symposium, buy a copy of the book. It's all great. I've been speaking with James Harper, Associate Professor in the University of Oregon's Department of the History of Art and Architecture. He curated the Barberini Tapestries, Woven Monuments of Baroque Rome, on view at the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art through January 21st, 2018. Thanks so much for watching.